Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you to our online audience too. I want to go ahead and say to start that if you think of questions and you're on Facebook Live right now listening, you can just put something in the comment field and it will come to our coordinator who will give me those questions later in the program tonight. So thank you very much. Facebook Live, by the way, is my preferred method at night of watching these programs, and I just think it's wonderful. Tonight I'm going to be talking about a blog I've been doing since December 2018. I had earlier in 2018 completed a PhD in clinical counselor education and supervision from the Pastoral Counseling Department at Loyola, Baltimore. I had done most of my hours towards my counseling licensure here at the Bowen Center, and the blog became a way for me to integrate my thinking about Bowen theory with my theological understanding and my own spirituality. In other words, it turned into quite a project. One of the most interesting things about the project is how I've had to define myself along the way. It is amazing how sloppy one's thinking is, or at least how sloppy my own thinking has been, until I am asked a particular question about something. It is one way of describing the importance of relationship processes themselves. None of us becomes a self in a vacuum. What I'm going to do tonight is describe these moments of defining myself and the impact it has had on me, and hopefully on the quality of what I'm writing. Some brief background. You will recall, of course, that December 2018 marked the beginning of Year A of the 3-year Revised Common Lectionary cycle. Just kidding. Let me unpack this a little. The lectionary contains prescribed readings for each Sunday of the church year. It's in a 3-year cycle, and then it starts over. Most of the Bible gets covered. Many denominations, including the Episcopal Church, the Lutherans, the Methodists, Presbyterians, United Church of Christ, Mennonites, American Baptists, not all congregations, of course, many of these major denominations participate in the Revised Common Lectionary. I'm going to stop here and read a recent blog I posted that was for this Sunday's readings. The posts take me about 6 minutes to read aloud. And I commented on this Isaiah passage, and you'll hear me discuss that in a minute, and also on the Matthew reading. And the Matthew reading is the verses that are very familiar. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but it is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, hides it under a bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. So those were the 2 readings that I was working with. And this is what I wrote. This week's gospel takes a surprising turn. In the previous verses, this is Matthew, part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has been comforting folks, reminding them that they are blessed precisely to the extent that they have been living humbly, peacefully, and purely. Suddenly, the tone of his Sermon on the Mountain shifts to one of challenge. He begins telling the gathered group that they are the salt of the earth. Then he is asking them, what good is salt if it loses its saltiness? What good indeed? If a person waters down all that makes her an individual, what use is she? Last night, I cooked supper for a family group, including one of my daughters who is about to have a child. Laughing, I asked her how she wanted it seasoned, given that pregnancy can make a person have very particular food preferences. Lots of garlic, she replied, lots of garlic. And it was good. It was very good. In cooking this meal, I was more interested in pleasing my daughter than in following my usual cooking style, or the wishes of anyone else joining us for supper. Accommodating her was what mattered. Overall, though, this interest in pleasing others can create problems. A person can tamp down on some personal way of being, one's own seasoning, call it, in the interest of making others happy. Letting others have it their way sometimes seems worth the loss of self. It can keep the peace when one holds back, on a temporary basis, that is. It is an uneasy peace built on falsity when one is hiding parts of oneself. While it may seem humble, squelching self is far from true humility. The harder road here is being true to oneself and representing one's own ideas in a mature, respectful way. Just as keeping table salt dry is essential, maintaining one's own inner salt involves thoughtful reflection. Salt as a seasoning is treasured because of how it brings out all the flavors in a dish. The metaphor invites each of us to bring all our gifts to the table, fully synthesized. When a person can be herself, it offers a light to the world in which reality is understood more clearly and wholly. Moreover, the inner freedom that comes with being herself also gets communicated to others. A light is shed, an interest, a curiosity, a respect for the views of others. In this atmosphere, people have a larger opportunity to connect in viable ways. The Isaiah readings bring these ideas to the test. Here, the question in verse 7 is regarding what makes a true fast. Isaiah asks, "Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own kin?" It seems to me that a family must think this through over time, their responsibility to, not for, others, and how they as a group will deal with these duties. When the duties involve a family member, the question becomes how a family can have difficult conversations rather than hiding from each other. Family leaders are, by definition, those with enough salt to be present with their own kin and enough light to calm everyone down. So that's a blog post, and that's the length of one. And it takes me, I'd say, about 6 hours total to write one of those. But I'll talk more about that later. I would like to stop here for a minute and show you all basically what this is the website where the blog post is, barbaralayman.com, and that is that second site is a podcast I'm getting ready to start. These are the questions for reflection. At the end of one of these posts, I put up questions for reflection, things to ask yourself in the morning, things to ask yourself in the evening. And what I try to do in the morning is set up a couple of questions that give one an intention for the day. And in the evening, I try to do kind of a mini Ignatian examine. I try to pull out some things, particularly for review through the day. So in this week, I asked, how can I bring light to my work, to my family, and when my salt get watered down? So one can kind of anticipate those moments when that might be a challenge sometimes. And then in the evening, what was difficult about sharing my own ideas today? How hard was it to be curious about what others were thinking? Part of my practice is to try to follow these during the week and see how well they are working for me. And so whether they are good questions or not. And this is some of the challenges of defining myself in this blog post. The first one is to keep it simple. And you know, Dr. Bowen was really big on not using psychobabble, any jargony words. And I also have a rule to myself. I do know a good bit of New Testament Greek. I have a rule to myself never to talk about that. So I try to weave it in without making it fancy. My maximum is 600 words. In 600 words, I can only do one idea. Sometimes that's a problem. If I think of more ideas, I write it in the notes that, you know, I'm keeping all this together in a manuscript form, and I write that down in my notes as something I might want to look at later. You know, in this particular example, what I could have done more with what apparently Jesus was talking about was that the Jewish people of his time were supposed to be a light to the nations, and they were losing their salt. And I could have talked about that as a process of all of us. How can we be the light? How can we be the leaders wherever we are? But that would have gotten me over my word limit, and also required a little more exploration of the text than I wanted to veer over to. The third thing, the questions for consideration. You know, it's a combined thing here because it was Dr. Bowen, I mean, it was a Bowen theory idea that made me first think of, oh, well, I know, I'll write questions. And I have been so excited about the utility of that because for anybody, you know, I try to write the questions so that regardless of how well differentiated you are or where you are in life, these questions could have meaning in your daily life. I don't have that written down here. But I'm very particular about this. This is for daily practice. And then I have followed the Ignatian Examen for a while and thought that it was actually the practices in there are what I wanted to mirror. The other thing about, you know, doing the question form is that I am using self-discovery for everyone and not talking to. So keeping the language in the continuous present as much as possible, that is an idea I got to try to mirror the Gospels, which are usually written in the continuous present. And that's what I try to do, and I think it really peps up my readings. So you can hear a lot of INGs in there, and I have had fun doing that, and it makes the ideas more, to me, they seem more timeless written that way. So I try to do that as much as possible. The next thing is this staying true to the text. That has been so great. I mean, you know, the creators of the lectionary really are brilliant. And the texts themselves, if I truly look at them and follow them, I seem to be closer to Bowen theory and closer to the meaning of the text. I mean, it seems to work both ways to me. So I trust them to bring balance. For example, in the one I just read to you all, the fact that that I had to go back and use the passage about what is a true fast. You know, it made it, to me, it made the whole reading more balanced because it wasn't just about your own salt. It seemed more that there's a reason for this, that there's justice involved here. So I like doing that. The other thing that I do is I stick to the human side of the readings. I do not do a lot of speculation about, you know, what I think God's purpose is. I try to stick to what the story is telling and sort out from that what I can learn. The last thing, the title of the blog, you know, the reflections is what I have listed on my web page, and that actually came from a friend, And I was talking to him one day about the meditations, and he said, well, they're really not meditations, they're reflections. And I thought, well, doggone it, he's right about that. So I have enjoyed using that. And then a subtitle for me, and I'm trying to think about how to use this, is reflections, and then a family counselor looks at the Sunday readings to give people a little more information about what I'm doing and who I am. One thing that's been really interesting about this is trying to do a blog and then trying to do, I've got one podcast posted, and I'm trying to get it going to the point that every week you could listen to a podcast about the coming Sunday readings. Because I just think that that's an audience, you know, there are people that have plenty of time sitting in their car or on the train that would like that. But I don't know how to do that. And I don't listen to a lot of that, so I don't have a lot of familiarity. And I have found that my children and their acquaintances, and in particular, you know, somebody my daughter knew who I could hire to help me with some of this, have been just so helpful. And the neat thing about it for me has been that they know me, and so they've been able to kind of steer me towards something that fit for me. And I think, you know, it's a great example of getting to know one's children and everything they bring to the picture, which sometimes we old folks forget about. But that has been exciting to see. And, you know, their work has been great. The thing that I have noticed about this is that it has taken a certain amount of humility from me on my part to ask these kinds of questions, because I'm a do-it-myself kind of person, and it has not gone well when I've tried to do these pieces myself. So before I go any further, because this is going to get, I'm going to go towards theology here in a minute, but do you all have any thoughts or questions about this more practical end of the spectrum? Yes.
I'll make a comment.
Yes, please.
Having read your blog, I noticed immediately that there was about a certain length. I noticed that you were raising questions. I knew that it had a consistent sort of flavor to it. And it's just very good to see the exact conscious framework that you've given yourself to work with it. I could sense some of it, and now to see the rest is
interesting.
Very helpful to me.
Okay, all right. Yes.
Yeah, who is this geared for?
This is geared for both lay leaders and clergy in congregations.
I mean, what would be the function of it in a congregation?
Because these are the Sunday readings, it, in my experience, is really useful to already have read them and thought about them before worship. Then I go into worship with a sort of with my own idea and energy towards the readings. And all the hymnody, everything in the services, the prayers are gathered around them too. I was going to talk about this later, but years and years ago, I was the Christian education person at a small church, and we decided to use the hour before worship for preparing for worship. And we did really neat stuff. We went through what the readings were and kind of gave a little background of each of them. We talked about who was on the prayer list and who needed prayers. If there were any new hymns, we practiced them, so that by the time we all walked in together. And so it was just a very, there's a lot of energy and excitement around that worship. And after that, is when I started, since then has been my discipline in my prayer life to center my prayer life around those readings. It's plenty to cover, it's plenty to think about. Yes.
If you're expanding on it's for lay readers and clergy, are you able to track by denomination and how many are reverends and how many are deacons or lay leaders, or how many total people go on the website and use your work?
No. I mean, I know that the number of totals, but I don't know who they are, what their background is.
Total.
I'm still at less than 100.
Okay.
Yeah. So right now it's still a labor of love. And that's one of the reasons for thinking about a podcast format. I think that I might get more traction going that direction. But I've been, learning and haven't been ready to really push it out. Like this has taken me a while to think through. So I also am kind of, I'm not a self-promoting kind of person, so that part is hard for me to do. But I think it's time. I think it's about as good as it's going to get. So, yes.
It sounds like these would be very useful for youth group leadership. Because it's a great way to have good conversations in cafes or, over whatever, an afternoon in the week or an evening in the week.
Actually,
it allows for a little downtime, but a little head time in the spiritual realm, and how practical this information can be for one's life.
yeah, thank you, Aunt. I've been thinking about that too. I've been thinking that, with that any small group, it's really conducive to small group settings, and I could set up some general discussion questions about, what popped out at you and which of these questions for reflection was most useful, and that, some general things like that to talk about each week that I think would be, I think it would give energy to the group to have something like that.
I'm an Episcopalian in a choir, and I try and listen to the gospel, and often in my church at least, the sermon is directly related to the gospel reading that we did prior to it. Do you, is that common, I guess? Do you well, I lost my good question.
I think that in churches that use the Revised Common Lectionary, it's quite common that the sermon is related to one of the texts. And, I have my own opinions about this.
And I know
but
that the website was one of the ministers indicated was interested in the parable of prodigal son, and he have a certain website that they use, but you use yours too.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Anything else?
For me, the energy behind the lectionary is using several texts and finding the places that they interweave.
Yeah.
Sometimes I use just one, but if I'm going to use just one, then just one's going to be read liturgically. I'm not going to read anything I'm not going to use in some way. And that really is, for me, the energy point is trying to find the interweavings. And that's the brilliance of whoever is the lectionary group.
Yeah.
That's just like
Yeah.
a trial witness. I don't even know who those people are, but the way they put these things together, sometimes I think, what are they thinking? But
Well.
oftentimes, and lectionary is a discipline because the more you stick with it, as hard as it is, the easier it becomes. At least it's been my experience. And so it's the interweaving. So what comes from the pulpit will be how I've seen those things interweave. I may lean on one more than the other, but if Isaiah and Matthew are the readings, I'm going to lean on one and use the other.
Thank you. Yeah,
That's what I do.
That's what you
The
do.
other thing is, when you talk about a family therapist looks at the readings, Is that a subtitle you're already using?
No, I've been thinking about whether that's a useful.
Well, from my standpoint, since there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of websites like this that clergy look at, lectionary preachers look at every single week. If I was passing through one, especially if you get to a weekly podcast on the iPhone, and it said out front at the very beginning, a family therapist looks at the readings, I'm going to choose that one. And the colleagues I have would choose that one over a biblical scholar any day. Any day, because we can get that stuff anywhere.
Thank you, that's useful. Carol, did you?
I was thinking about coming up on texts that are just very difficult.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, are those the ones that you lean into, or are there times when you say, we'll do that another time?
You know, this isn't a great example, but last week, I think it was last week, this is recent, and I, by the way, I get my weeks all mixed up now because I'm writing for the next Sunday, and I'm and they're here, and the other one in church, and I'm also confused. But
coming up this week is not particularly fun.
yeah, well, the one on immaturity, Paul calls the Corinthians babies, and anyhow, all three of the readings are about growing up. So I just decided to grab onto it, and I called it "Grow Up" was the name of the what I wrote. But you know, I'm not recalling anything right now, but I do think that sometimes that's very similar to family systems work. I mean, there are things in it that are hard, they're hard news. They're ultimately good news, but they're not easy to hear and, you know, easy to wrestle with. So, you know, even this script, the one that I just read about, that the piece about, you know, where somebody gets scolded about, how did this go? Ignoring your family members. What did he say? He said, oh, I don't have it. It's up. It's only online. But anyhow, is it what makes a true fast? To share your bread with the hungry, bring the homeless poor into your house. When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin. Now, that's pretty harsh. But I was glad that it was done for me, right? I mean, that's in the scripture. So. Okay. Tabby, did we have any questions? Anybody? Okay, all right. Well, once I finished my dissertation, I had a chance to think about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. Now, this had been a topic that I had considered using for my dissertation, but I decided not to. And so the idea of writing about the lectionary was still in the back of my mind, and I thought, well, I could do a blog on it. And I remembered, that I'd had some encouragement about it, and I thought if it's going to happen, I'd better get started. So creating the time for it actually as a way of defining myself, that actually has been easier than I would have thought. I have an aim. It's to get a blog up for the Sunday readings by the previous Monday night. So for instance, this week, it took me until Tuesday morning, but anyhow, I posted for this coming Sunday. And to do this, I begin writing on Saturday morning. And so what that means is that before Saturday morning, say starting Wednesday or Thursday, I start reading up on different commentaries on the scripture passages. And I use several different things. I use Christian Century, I use Sojourners, and I use, I go from kind of I would say I use some standard commentaries. And then I also, just for fun, that beautiful book on the Psalms that's just come out. Do you all know what who I'm talking about? I can't think of the guy's name. A Hebrew, and he's done a whole Bible, but before that, about 2 years ago, he published his own translation of the Psalms. No, but I'm sorry. But anyhow, I should have written that down. But anyhow, I used that. So for several days, I'm kind of gearing up in my mind for, okay, and this is what these readings are. And I also take a look at the Greek, which is fun for me. I like the Greek. Once I start writing, I can usually get a draft done in a couple of hours, and then I get my husband to look at it. He's good at spotting the weaknesses or saying when he doesn't get something. And as I think about it more, I usually have changes and additions I want to make. It's a mistake to post that thing too fast, because usually overnight I'll think of some things. But I do stop and I try to just go ahead and post it on Mondays, finished or not, perfect or not. And then I try to use my questions during the week. And so this pretty much is defining me, week to week, what I'm doing. I've been interested in the Revised Common Lectionary for a long time. And this is where I go into about practice at that church. So deciding not to use the lectionary for my dissertation was one of the first ways I had to define myself. How it happened was that one day, probably 2015 or so, our priest came to visit me. She was in our home, and we got to talking about potential dissertation topics. Now, I'm at Loyola, Baltimore, so it's a Jesuit school. I'm in the pastoral counseling department. And I told her about my years of reading and thinking about the lectionary, and I showed her some of the books I use, and there's writing all in the margins. And she just looked at me and said, "You've got to do this." So that was pretty strong encouragement. And I decided that it was not an appropriate topic for the dissertation, but that it would work, later on. And when I decided that, I was a little bit disappointed. I thought, oh, gee, all this time and energy I've spent on this, and it's not going to work. But it didn't make sense. I knew that there would be people, with far more background at Loyola than me if I took it there and tried to do a total religious synthesis. So the fascinating and wonderful thing, though, about the decision was how it worked towards this blog. Because, I did my dissertation. It was a quantitative analysis, which I actually do know what I'm doing. And I did it on a Bowen theory subject, individuality and togetherness. And I found my way to all the major ideas that support these blog posts. So that's what I'm going to be talking about here. Individuality and togetherness was my topic, and one of my professors, my advisor for my dissertation, was patiently reading a draft, and these guys, they really do have my undying gratitude. And it was a draft about evolutionary theory and individuality and togetherness. And he looked at that and he said, "Barbara," he said, "you need to be reading in natural theology," which honestly I had to go look up what it was. So I already had an affinity for the ideas. I had a book on my bedside table that I have used for a long time called Reason and Emotion by John McMurray. He was a Scottish philosopher and early speaker in the temple lectures. His main idea is that mature religion is individual integrity in true communion. And how similar is that to individuality and togetherness? I just didn't know that I was pursuing natural theology at the time. And in terms of integrating and synthesizing my ideas, one book, Elizabeth Johnson's Ask the Beast, Darwin and the God of Love, has helped me more than anything. She has several chapters in there on Darwin. She talks about the theology, the current theology, natural theology around that. And my response to these books has been part of defining myself. First of all, McMurray talks about emotional reason in his book. And I use that a lot. I find that it's a good way to talk with clients about the separation of thinking and feeling and how to be able to reason with one's emotions and how that actually happens in human life. And they seem to hear that, and anyhow, that's been useful to me as a way of talking about the intellectual and emotional systems. And secondly, and this is Elizabeth Johnson's book, and you'll see up there that I have a quote from John Bonner. He was an evolutionary biologist, and he observed across all the levels of life he studied, the viability of individuals depends on their functional integration as part of the larger system, and that the viability of the group depends on the functional integrity of its individual constituents in the larger system. So again, that's individuality and togetherness in evolution. This next picture, this is a famous story in Genesis of the three angels that visit Abraham. And I know some of you all know more about this than me. But it's a beautiful picture, and the icon, you know, if I knew more about the Greek, the way they do these, the way their heads are tilted in connecting with each other, but still maintaining their individual identity. I just think it's a beautiful meditation on individuality and togetherness. And then the quote on the left is from Michael Nell. He talks about the Zulu saying umuntu, umuntu, gubantu, which can be translated as a person is a person in relation to other persons. I am because you are. And I think it's extremely important to remember that in terms of connecting with others. In other words, it doesn't do any good to define yourself in a vacuum. You have to define yourself in relationships. So relational theology makes a lot of sense to me, and I think that it is how we evolved. We evolved to survive as groups. So the evolutionary processes that that we're only now beginning to understand have existed since before time began. If one thinks of God as creator, and if one thinks in terms of this picture of a Trinity, so I know I'm talking Christian theology here, but that in the Godhead itself there is individuality and there is togetherness, and that was what got imprinted into all of creation. I mean, it's everywhere, up and down the spectrum. That's how I think about it. That is what I think. So how I see it is that if these evolutionary processes are expressions of the divine, and that's how I think about it. I mean, that's reality, right? Every subatomic particle is an individual, but it's connected to other particles all the way up the ladder to us and everything else that exists. So if it is an expression of the creation, then that means that the incarnation is much deeper than just one person coming to earth, that the incarnation is in everything we're seeing. That's what I think. And so that when I am working on defining myself with others, that's a holy act. That's what I think. So lest I get too airborne here, I'm going to talk about some specifics in my own thinking, and I have Randy Frost to thank for this. He sent me an email last spring and said he'd been reading my blog, and he asked me a whole bunch of questions. And so I had to start replying, and so I said to him, when I got interested in Bowen theory, it was important to me that it was consistent with my faith. I can remember this very well. I wanted a counselor. I'd been introduced to the theory, so I knew I wanted Bowen theory, but I wanted somebody who went to church. And I did find that person. So it was that important to me that it was consistent to my faith, and I listened to everything and measured against my faith. But Bowen theory did one better. It helped me to understand my faith. So much of the scripture makes more sense to me when seen from a family systems view. And I have just seen this over and over again for myself, that these things, it's like the scales just fall from my eyes when I start thinking Romans. But folks, that's not what happened. Sin and death did not come into the world through us. I mean, death has always been here. And I love Romans, but I have to say, you know, when you take that screen, it's the truth that sets you free, and you go back and you look at that, you start getting a little more freedom to rethink some things. Sin and death are part of how the world has evolved. So the sin question is a question that I'm still, I don't know how many decades of my life, or even if I'm going to have enough time to sort this one out. I'm only getting started in understanding it. So, but what I think right now is that if it's the truth that sets us free, then not seeing reality is moving towards sin, maybe. I don't know. The more we can understand the whole truth, the bigger the picture, the more emotionally neutral we become, and the less we are in bondage to sin. That's one way to think about it. But another way to think about it, so that if you think about sin as being stuck in your emotions and unable to think your way out of it, then you're moving towards thinking about reactivity. And, you know, when you think about reactivity, well, you know, if you've read the book Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, zebras don't get ulcers because they're reactive. I mean, because they have, if there's a rustle in the bush over here, they're off. And they're programmed to do that, and they know to do that. And so that's an instinct that's built into them, so that in some way their reactivity was adaptive for them. And that's what, it's my understanding, is what we're up against as humans, is that we now have these frontal lobes, so we can do a little sort on when is that rustle a good thing or a bad thing, what do we want to do about it, and yet see thinking our way out of something that's that instinctive and that deeply inside of us, that's what we're up against as human beings. Now, I don't think that's sin either. So, but there is sin. There are trespasses. So where does that fit? I don't know, but I'm thinking about that one. Another, over there on his little diagram, the questions one, a question that I've always thought a lot about is questions of theodicy, a just God in an unjust world. That's bothered me a lot over my lifetime, and yet if one thinks about evolution as a process instilled by the Creator in this world, then theodicy is kind of moves over to a non-issue. I mean, it's not the bottom line anymore, because this is part of the process. It's kind of comforting is maybe not the right word. I don't know what the right word is, but you know, we all come from very human families, and so but that's part of the process here. And if one thinks about individuality and togetherness as the participation of the divine in this life, then one is again thinking about the answer to the theodicy questions. Back to my blog, A place where I focus and where I'm an expert is on what humans with a low level of differentiation of self are up against. I had an email from Scotty Hargrove, who was also on my dissertation committee once I started working on my blog. He commented on my capacity to describe the human side of the scripture readings. This was very useful to me. It's funny sometimes how useful it is to have what one is doing, just simply what one is doing reflected back. I mean, the lack of self-awareness is extraordinary, at least for me. At any rate, in my blog posts, I try to stay away from speculating on what God is doing. I'm interested in finding insight on relationship processes, and the family systems lens helps me to understand what is really happening, what is true, and what can be seen about life. Another idea that has been useful to me is the need for repetition in learning a family systems view. Every week I write about some theoretical principle that I see in the scripture. So far, and I've been at this a year and 3 months, there's always something with the family system slant in the scriptures. Something folks might not see if not for a systems view. And that's all. Yes.
I was thinking about, you used the word truth, and I discovered some old journals I hadn't read, so this was in 2012 journal, and it's one of his presentations, and he defines truth versus facts, and he is about the facts, and truth is subject to the emotional sense of the individual who relates to that. So, and it's very difficult to be in a group of people who talk about spiritual or supernatural things and be able to relate to facts. Very difficult. There's some people in the network that are working on that. But anyway, I just wanted to make that comment that Murray Bowen was, the distinction that he had was that the facts are not the truth, because the truth has a lot more wiggle room and the facts are absolute. So the challenge is, how do you see the facts and see them so that there isn't wiggle room left much? It's far less.
Well, thank you. You know, what I've noticed for me is that more facts helps. I mean, just that if I can just get a wider lens. And so I don't guess I'll ever get to the truth, the full truth. But I'm not sure that's what he was saying. You're talking about Bowen.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
In your local congregation where you worship, have you found that your blog has made some shifts in your relationship with the pastoral staff?
No.
Do they engage you or not?
No. And I don't talk about it much at where I worship.
They know it exists.
The pastoral staff does, yes.
But they don't engage you. See good writing or interesting. Not surprising.
Well, you know, as you point out, there's plenty to read on these things, and I have been asked, let us know when you get the newsletter going, which I only did just a few weeks ago. So there has been that kind of movement, and it could be on me that I've not been pushy enough, or not self-promoting enough, so that people think it's still in kind of a draft form.
Well, you can come join my church. I'll put you right.
No, I love my church. I love my church, and I love my church, and I love our minister. So yeah.
Okay, you're at a Jesuit university. Do Catholics have a lectionary too?
They do. I'm actually not Catholic, I'm Episcopal.
Okay.
And, but the Catholic lectionary is a little different. Some weeks our readings match and some weeks they don't. Some weeks they match and some weeks they don't.
Okay.
The Rubla icon that you use in the community, are you aware of the little square and what the suggestion is of that? The suggestion has been that at one point there was a mirror there. So that brings the person who's observing, who's looking, into that dance and relationship system, which is kind of cool.
That is cool.
Brings stuff in.
Mm-hmm.
The work that I've done, I've used process theology, which I think fits very well with Bowen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I've done more, I've actually been somewhat heretical in suggesting that Bowen theory adds to an understanding of the divine and what the divine is about. Using process theology pulls in the idea of evolution being this ongoing creativity that has to do with being able to hold differences together. And yeah, so that's kind of a key central thought.
Tell me, in your experience, what, I mean, I sense this, but I don't know how to articulate it, that creativity adds a big piece to this. I mean, the acknowledgement of it and the seeing of it.
Creativity, not necessarily as you're sitting and being an artist or a musician or something, but creativity is what comes, it's to an extent the idea of emergence, what emerges out of their partner, it's been a while, through evolution, when something completely new has come out.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the idea that it's somehow holding those differences together that allows that to come out. And the emergent things are actually bigger jumps than that, but even just moving on in smaller steps in evolution. I hadn't thought about the theodicy part with it too much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I have a tendency to use togetherness in you're thinking about togetherness is slightly different from the way I think about togetherness. Because I hear community, individuality and community from what you say. Whereas I have a tendency to think individuality and togetherness not necessarily being a differentiated community.
Yeah, yeah. And I think about togetherness kind of on a spectrum from mushy, yucky to good. To being able to enjoy that togetherness but still be a self.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. As Barbara said, she kind of takes the lead and goes on. Well, she introduced herself.
I did.
So, hello, I'm Ann Gordon Kern. And I get the speakers for this evening's meetings, for the Thursday Professional Lecture Series. And Barbara jumped at the opportunity, but she never sent me the bio. And when she passed it to me tonight, it was 3 lines. And I thought, I can't be but so creative with 3 lines. Thank goodness it came at the last minute, because I don't know what I would have done with that. But she did a very good job introducing herself in terms of how she got here, and that's what I was kind of interested in. Next month, we will be meeting here in March, and the speaker will be Patricia Camella. She's speaking on searching for harmony between human societies and their sustaining environments. And this is sort of a lead-in to the spring conference that will be in April. And I hope you all will look that up. It's going to be on climate change and the impact on everything, and the inputs and the impacts. So please look at that. I think you'll find a lot there to be interested in. Victoria Harrison has been leading the the way in terms of engaging speakers with the committee, and it's looking pretty exciting. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much,
Thank you.
Barbara.
Thank you.
for being here
Thank you,
tonight.
Ann.